Hey, everybody. I think we're all here. Um, just wanted to acknowledge that I know it's been pretty tough for folks to show up to things this week, and I just wanted to thank you guys for coming. We really appreciate it. We've got a great lecture prepared for you today, which I'll introduce in a moment. Um, this is my one slide about resources. These are my four favorite resources that you might want this week. Critical Media Literacy Research Guide. That could take hours. That's a long list of links. Explaining the news to our kids, that could take minutes. It's just a quick article. And then these two hotlines below both have texting. So I believe Tamsin is going to put those links in the chat. And if you have any questions about those, feel free to reach out to me. My name is Paige Archer. Um, I'm the assistant director of the Celtic. Also, let me go back. Welcome to welcome to week 6 of the Sustainability Business and Entrepreneurship Lecture Series. Yeah, there we are. We've got 3 left. Next week, Sean Moore from the Thurston Center for Business and Innovation. He's going to go over all the resources that are free here and just how to navigate them. So the Celtic is the Center for Entrepreneurial Leadership Transformational Change. We're a public service center here on the Olympia campus. I'm the assistant director. Tamsin Foucre is the director. We host this lecture series. We have a few certificates in the PACE program, daytime course offerings, and we coordinate internships. So if you're a student who's interested in an internship in the for-profit sector, or if you're a community partner in that field and you're looking for academic interns to support your work, connect with us. Our co-sponsor is Thurston Green Business, which is a business designation you can get if your business is located here in Thurston County. It's free and easy to apply. They'll start taking applications January 1st. Our fiscal sponsor is the Clean Energy Committee, which is the student-led committee here at Evergreen with the mission to support clean energy projects and share sustainability strategies. So thank you, CEC. If you're a student and you haven't taken this survey yet, please do. It's really hard to find. It got sent from a weird email. Sorry about that. It's important. It's sort of what legislator uses to measure how our basic needs are being met. So your responses are really helpful and important. And if you have any questions about that, you can contact ARC Basic Needs at evergreen.edu. This screening is coming up next month on Monday, November 18th from 3 to 5:30. It's free and open to the public. There will be coffee and snacks. It's an 80-minute documentary that will be followed by a panel discussion. It's produced by Northwest Treaty Tribes and the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. This film is great. It came out this year. It's already won awards. Please come. So we have Micah with us today. Micah Sherman is one of the founders and co-owners of Raven, a small independently owned and operated cannabis cultivator in Olympia, Washington. Through that work, Micah has been involved in policy and organizing work at the state and federal level to improve cannabis policy for people and the plant. He works to provide an example of how business and regulation can coordinate to make the economy work for ordinary people and nature. Cannabis policy can lead by example in how we cultivate better outcomes for everyone. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you, Micah.
Thanks. Appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you guys today. I am Micah Sherman, and like I said, like that nice introduction said, I own Raven Grass here in Olympia, Washington, and um, a little bit about myself and my background before I get started on my remarks about cannabis policy and all of that. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and graduated high school actually at the Portland Community College, where I went for a few more years after that. I took several years before figuring out what I wanted to do with my sort of educational pursuits, and eventually worked for several years in the building trades industry, and then went on to get a architecture degree. And I worked in the this planning, business, and development world for several years, working on various, uh, mostly residential construction and development. And then in 2012, when both Washington and Colorado legalized cannabis recreationally, I decided to, along with my co-founder of Raven, Nicole Graff, decided to move here to Washington State and become cannabis cultivators. And the reason why we wanted to do that was both, we were ready for changes in our lives at that time, professionally and where we were living, but we also saw in the legalization of commercial cannabis for the first time in the country that there was going to be this unique opportunity to take a very large economy that has existed illicitly in the traditional market since prohibition began, bringing this existing market into the regulated space was going to be a pretty unique opportunity to do something at an incredibly large scale that's never been done before and likely won't be recreated. And we saw in that an opportunity to demonstrate how things could be different in something that was built with intention out of prohibition. And so we knew that the process would be difficult and complex, and we wanted to be a part of that. We wanted to be able to start something from the beginning and not have the sort of let's call it the baggage that comes along with lots of industries and lots of things that we try to do in our professional lives. There's a lot of history to that. So this is interesting to us in that perspective, and we still pursue the business and in running it in a way that is thoughtful about that. And that's what I wanted to talk about here today was the way that we think about the cannabis economy and how that's brought us into working on government policy and public policy around cannabis. So in 2017, we started working on a piece of legislation with our former rep here in the Olympia area, Lori Dolan, which would have allowed small cannabis growers to sell directly to the consumer in the same style as a microbrewery in the beer space, or a micro distillery in the spirit space. And the reason why we picked that particular policy to focus on was because we saw that in the construction of the cannabis market in Washington State, there were certain decisions that were made by the people that wrote the initiative and then implemented the legislation that worked for the state. And a lot of these choices weren't focused on the outcomes in the economy that they were producing. They were focused on other considerations. So there was restrictions that the federal government placed on these new kind of experimental adult use regulated markets, and there was a lot of concerns about what was allowed and what was not allowed for people that worked for the state to do. So this whole complicated legal structure was created, and that is what forms the cannabis economy that we know. It was built along the lines of the rules and the law. And a lot of that was based on people's understanding of the economy, and there's what I call like the mental models that people have for how the economy works that are based on principles that we have come to sort of think of as normal in our understanding of the economy. And so we think about it as like transactions between people where there's uh, uh, an exchange of goods and services for money. And then we measure those exchanges and transactions, and we try to evaluate how things are doing purely based on kind of understanding the economy simply through transacting and spending money in exchange. And it's very individualistically focused on people and firms, and it doesn't often think about things holistically or, as a whole. It thinks about things very individualistically and as a bunch of little parts that relate to each other through transaction. And so that is the sort of normal way that people think about the economy. And in doing this work, I've learned about what is called ecological economics, which is an understanding of the economy not through individualized transactions, but through relational systems between people and other living beings and the Earth. And this has informed both how we've run our business as well as what we've tried to do in this public policy space. And so obviously as cultivators ourselves, we have to think about caring for plants and healthy soil, and there's a lot of ecology in cultivating anything, but cannabis as well. And so we have this kind of caretaking, cultivating, tending mindset in our work, and we want to see that um, come through into the business ecosystem that we operate in as well. And so in trying to get this new privilege for small growers to be able to have this direct relationship with the consumer, we're trying to think about how do relationships between people uh, become just as important as the monetary transactions in how we evaluate whether or not something is working, something is successful. And so thinking about the economy and businesses and licensing and who gets to do what with whom, not just thinking about that purely in a commercial context, but thinking about it in a relational context. And that in that uh, public policy choice of whether or not growers can have direct relationships with consumers, there's definitely a economic and transactional component to it, and it would be helpful to growers to be able to have that direct exchange monetarily. It's also about creating an ecosystem that we all live in and exist in. And so, more importantly, there, it's about allowing things to be done between people so that they can get their needs met. And if it also works uh, in the commercial setting, that's great, but it doesn't have to be the only consideration. And so often these conversations about how do we engage public policy in the world of markets and commerce gets boiled down to this sort of traditional understanding of all of that, which is that when the government does something related to markets, that it's intervening on something that already existed. And the rollout of cannabis, legal cannabis, I think has really put that sort of normal understanding of the economy to some pretty significant question because while we did have an illicit market for cannabis, a traditional market for cannabis prior to this, there was no legal adult use regulated market in Washington State. It's purely a product of the laws and the policies that were put into place. And so the responsibility for what it looks like is really on the onus of public policy in a way that isn't as clear in the rest of the economy. Although I do still think that it's true that markets and the economy are predicated on law and public policy and what sort of choices came first to set the table for those markets to exist in. And that is super clear in the cannabis space that what the public policy is the biggest determining factor into what's possible to happen next. And so what we're trying to do with these cannabis policies is not to ask the government to come in and intervene on behalf of one actor or another in the economy, but it's to take responsibility for what possibilities exist in that economy and what market crafting roles they have, and then applying those principles of uh, building resiliency and sustainability and diversity and uh, into the actual underpinnings of the rules and regulations, and then as a result, into the economy that we exist in. And so, Washington State, in the cannabis world, we only have retail stores that are allowed to sell to consumers and that are allowed for us to sell to. And that creates some pretty significant choke points in the cannabis economy that have disproportionately empowered some over others. And so our goal is to create resiliency in how the cannabis economy is structured so that everybody has more options and opportunities in what they can do with their business, as well as how consumers can interact with us. And that I think is really important in creating resiliency in our ecosystem. And resiliency in the world of ecology and in soil or in plant health is about having lots of options for how we get what we need. And so, or how a plant gets what it needs. And that's what we're trying to create in these economic ideas is resiliency. And that is often in contradiction with what people think of as efficiency. Things that are resilient are sustainable and flexible and accommodating to lots of different ways of doing things, but things that are efficient are often not that. And so the idea of efficiency, as we think about it in the context of modern mainstream economics, is often really detrimental to the health of systems. And so economies are complicated living systems. They're not a series of discrete interactions. And so I think we need to think about the mental models of the economy in this ecologically systems-minded way, as opposed to the sort of individualized transactional way that we do. And the direct sales and that aspect of the cannabis world is an example of how we can think about things in a way that we're building resiliency, opportunities for diversity and different ways of doing things, different ways of being. These are all really important aspects of a healthy ecology that we don't really try to bring into the economy. And that's what the goal of ecological economics is to think about the economy as a complex living system so that we need to build in resiliency rather than solely focusing on efficiency. We need to build in opportunities for diversity through, through solidarity across difference into the firm. We need to do all of the things that ecologists have long pointed to about healthy systems and bring them into our mental models of the economy. And so in the cannabis world, there's lots of different things we can do that. But it requires public policymakers to acknowledge a couple of things that I think the mainstream neoclassical understanding of economics uh, has sort of precluded them from being willing to do. So I find that in my conversations with legislators, with people that work for the state, at different agencies, they have this sort of traditional understanding of the way that things work. And they're always trying to tailor their public policy prescriptions so that they work within the way that things work because people want their policies to be successful. And I think breaking through the barrier of our sort of mainstream understanding of the economy requires us to push back on those assumptions about how things work and what leads to success and how we define success and how we measure success. All of these things in the mainstream uh, economics are again based on transaction and money and profits and extraction and accumulation. These are all the things that we measure as success in that mental model. And whereas I think in a living systems approach, we would measure and evaluate and find success in, like I said, resiliency and health and free time and enjoyment and all the things that get left out of transactions. And um, how we can bring that into other realms of the economy from cannabis, I think uh, is also one of the goals of why we came into this and why we're doing what we're doing in the cannabis space is to be a demonstration of the ways we can approach things that are different from what we've traditionally done and can lead to different kind of successes that we've really yet to integrate into like how we go about designing commercial systems. So the work of this direct sales bill in Washington has also brought us into coalition with people all around the country who are working on similar ideas in their states and to a national coalition. It's called the National Craft Cannabis Coalition, and it's a group of trade associations that predominantly represent small growers throughout the country. And this same concept of being able to sell directly to the consumer was put forward into Congress in last year, and it'll be reintroduced here as well. And that bill would on national legalization of cannabis, it would allow for small growers and small processors throughout the country to mail cannabis to a consumer anywhere in the country that allowed for cannabis to be legal where they lived. And so the goal there is not so much to get that bill passed by itself, but our goal is to influence the conversation that's happening at the national level so that the interests and ideas of small cultivators and their consumers are brought into the conversation at the national level. Because the same thing that's happened over the last 10 years at all the state levels is right now happening at the national level where policymakers are coming together to determine how they're going to go about legalizing cannabis and what that means, in the world for the people that want to participate in it. And so the choices that get made at the federal level in the next several years on this subject, maybe longer than it was a few weeks ago. Um, yeah, I can definitely put a link in there to the bill when I'm done talking. Thanks.
Micah, I can
Um,
look it up. What's the name of the bill again?
it's called the SHIP Act, and it was introduced by Jared Huffman out of Northern
Okay,
California.
I can find it.
Yeah, there's a press release on the website you link to. Um, yeah, so the idea there is there's this complicated conversation happening between all kinds of different interest groups at the federal level, and we found that the interests of cultivators was nowhere to be seen in that conversation. And so our goal in getting this idea introduced into that conversation was to start to make some really specific examples of how we can go about building the national cannabis economy with an ecologically minded approach by identifying the sort of core relationship that we wanted to make sure was the center of legal cannabis. And for us, that's about cultivating the plant. And so that relationship between cultivator and plant is super important. And we wanted it to be centered. And then the next relationship that we think is fundamental to a healthy cannabis economy is between the cultivator and the consumer. And so the goal of the SHIP Act and the logic of that policy is about making sure that the cultivator is central and that the first significant relationship that's built in the economy is between the cultivator and the consumer. And that transaction having no intermediaries, being always able to be accessed is going to be a building block upon which the rest of the industry can be built from knowing that no matter what else happens, that relationship is important. And that's the sort of difference between, I think, an ecological conception of a cannabis economy versus a traditional mainstream conceptualization of a cannabis economy, where they started with the firm and they started with the owners of the firm and they created a licensing structure that centered around firms and owners and then gave coordination rights, privileges to do things with other people based on that licensure and ownership. And so we, from the very beginning of this project, have created a transactional, uh, ownership-driven, employment-based economy. And that's because we always think about those things as just being the sort of base components of an economy. And in reality, an economy is about the actual thing that we're trying to do in the world. And these other things around there are just the tools that we've created to allow ourselves to do that in a way that's effective. And so when those tools stop being effective to where we want to get to, we can't just continue to try to use them for something that's not working. And that's, I think, where we're at right now in cannabis is we are attempting this process of converting a traditional illicit market into a legal regulated market. And we're trying to use the tools that we think the economy is built on, and we're ignoring a lot of the tools um, that exist. And so the next thing I wanted to talk about was to give some examples about how the same kind of thinking can apply to and lead us to a path of solutions for a different thing. So I mentioned earlier that I started my career in housing and in architecture and development, and so I want to take just a few minutes here at the end to talk about the housing economy and how these ideas of um, what are the core relationships of an economy? How do they create sort of conditions for other things to happen around it? And what's sort of gone wrong in housing and how these ideas can inform our thinking about that and bring us to answers. So I would suggest that the fundamental thing, the most important public policy in housing is the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, which is a product of federal policy. That is not a financial instrument that would have existed were it not for the federal government creating it in the New Deal era. It came out of a very intentional desire to build a housing ecosystem that was stable, had stable pricing, and allowed for a development ecosystem to build around it that was held together by the fact that the 30-year mortgage was always guaranteed by the federal government. And so everybody that was involved in home construction that was going to eventually be sold in the market with a 30-year mortgage knew that they had stability because of that public policy decision. And so that allowed a whole ecosystem of companies, builders, uh, building material manufacturers, distributors, the whole everybody involved in it came together around this tool of coordination that enabled banks and home builders and homeowners to engage in this complicated process of planning the expansion of the American suburbs. And right, so we have the 30-year mortgage and everything that came off of that. And so we need to think about our current moment in housing in the same kind of way. What relationships exist? How does public policy form and shape them? What are we missing in the same way that in cannabis we're missing this core relationship between consumer and cultivator? In the world of housing, we're missing the ability for, and this may sound simpler and stupider than I mean it, we're missing the ability for someone that needs a home to have one made for them because they need a place to live. We don't have a mechanism for that in this country. We only have mechanisms for building housing that is profitable for somebody to build. And then we use public policy to change the conditions of what's profitable for builders, and we call that subsidy. However, in a ecologically minded approach to the housing economy, we can identify ways of building housing that don't revolve around the market and don't need the logic of a market transaction to get produced. But we need the public policy, like the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, to be able to create the conditions for an ecosystem of development to be constructed so that non-market housing can be produced. And so we should think about how do we create the social housing version of a 30-year fixed rate mortgage so that we can build business ecosystems to build the housing that people need at a price that they can afford. Uh, the reason why we don't have affordable housing right now is not because we can't build it. It's not because we don't have the physical resources or that it's inherently too expensive. It's because we've structured that development system around public policy that produces a lot of money to build housing, but it doesn't allocate that money where it needs to go because the logics of housing construction are about profit and not houses. And so in Washington State, we have an initiative that's been put forward for many years in the legislature to create a Washington State public bank, which would allow us as citizens through our municipalities and other state agencies to use our public deposits that we all pay to the state for our taxes. And rather than storing those dollars in a commercial bank, we would get our own bank charter as a state, and we would put all of our deposits in that bank. And then we would collectively own the bank, which would then be able to go and loan money to all of our cities and counties to do the sort of public works projects that we need. And it would also allow us through either the counties have housing authorities or through the State Housing Finance Commission, we could actually fund the construction of housing that was not intended to be sold on the market and could be priced in a way that was based on what it costs to build, not the most money that could be made in doing it. And so that, just to connect it back with the sort of ecological approach to uh, mental models for the economy, I'm trying to suggest that we can think about what sort of relationships allow us to coordinate with each other to do the sort of real world things in the economy that we only think about being done through the market now. And that we think about the ways that public policy shapes the ability for us to relate to each other in these ways to produce the things that we need to care for the world that we live in, to care for each other. All of these things that often get left out of transactions and money making and uh, that sort of approach to the economy, and it starts to build that same level of complication and sophistication that we put into markets because they are very sophisticated and complicated, and they allow us to do lots of very of things that we don't really have lots of other ways to do. But it doesn't need to be the only tool that we use, and it can be used alongside. I often say to people about this sort of idea for a non-market housing ecosystem that it would also make market housing a lot better because right now, market housing has to constantly try to be accommodating and creating something which is housing that people can afford in contradiction to like what it's supposed to do. And it doesn't do it very well. And as a result, a lot of the material resources that go into these projects are underutilized or there's misinvestment or malinvestment. And if we had a building ecosystem, a development ecosystem that could build affordable housing for everybody, all of those people that were involved in that work would also be able to be involved in market housing development when they wanted to, or that was a better use of their time in that moment. So this goes back to the concept I talked about earlier, which is resiliency. Uh, the focus of our common ways of thinking about the economy that are really focused on efficiency, which is measured by how much money is left over for owners at the end of the cycle of or the accounting period. That's how we measure efficiency most of the time, or energy use. But when we think about resiliency, which is also a really important characteristic for us to think about in our lives, there's no way to measure that in that efficiency paradigm. So what I'm hoping to come out of this is when we think about how does public policy shape the world we live in, we keep in mind that we can expect our public policymakers to think about how do their decisions about regulation and rules shape our relationships with each other in determining what's possible for us to do, how we coordinate with each other. How does the public policy sphere extend coordination rights as opposed to just property rights for us to be in economic relationship with each other? And how do we help public policymakers move beyond the mental model of exchange and transaction and money being the way that we evaluate everything to just being a way that we evaluate part of a thing, and that the holistic view of the economy includes a lot more than that, and often would need, I think, to be more focused on the quality of our relationships with each other, our ability to live sustainably on the earth, and the ability for us to continue forward into the future, because the current arrangement is not allowing for that possibility. And so I think it's incredibly important that we change our mental models of the economy away from the ones of the orthodox understanding of economics and bring in other ways of thinking about economy, what it means to be a business owner, what it means to be in making money. All of those ideas are conceptions that we've made up, and whether or not they're useful is should constantly be under evaluation. And so I think that we need to speak to our public policymakers about these misconceptions so that they can better work with us to build solutions. Because in my experience right now, we don't have a lot of opportunity with public policymakers to find success on a lot of these really complicated issues. Um, I'm not particularly optimistic that we're on the right track, but that doesn't mean that I don't have hope that we can get there. Um, and so I know it's a difficult time in this project that we're undertaking together, and we all need to continue to figure out ways to be in the world and to move forward the projects that we care about. And we're lucky that there is some opportunity here in Washington State to continue to do that. And I would encourage everybody to get get in conversation with their state representatives and the people that represent us in the Senate, and ask them about, how they think about their responsibilities for market crafting. What do they think their obligations are to us in their role as our representatives in ensuring that the economy is a place where we can all get our needs met and not just a place where we get taken advantage of and have our resources extracted. And so that's the hope of this, and I really appreciate you guys taking some time to listen to me, and happy to answer any questions. Yeah, that's a terrific question, and a topic of much conversation amongst the groups I'm involved in. And uh, definitely we can be. And the ways that that can be done, in my opinion, is by ensuring that we don't end up in a situation where choke points are the determining factor in outcomes in the market or in the economy. So examples of that are like in Washington State, we only have the one path to market with retailers. In California, they have a thing called mandatory distribution. So in California, you can grow cannabis and you can sell it yourself, but you need to have all the different licenses, including a distribution license. And so that's a point in their supply chain where there's a choke point. And so all of the cannabis economies around the states are often predicated on some sort of choke point. And I think if we're going to have an economy that's accessible to small growers in perpetuity, yeah, we're going to need to make sure that we really avoid building artificial choke points. There's lots of different kinds of public banks. What's been on offer in Washington thus far would support credit unions in a sort of infrastructural standpoint, but it wouldn't look to like replace credit unions, and they would still be the sort of consumer intermediary in the banking system, and that the public bank would work with municipalities, agencies, uh, counties, things along that line for funding. There's a state bank in North Dakota, and they do some work directly. So they're responsible for most of the student loans in North Dakota, for example. So they have a much less of a student loan issue there as a result. So there's definitely opportunities for a public bank to do lots of different things, but the things that have the bills that have been put forward thus far in Washington are more limited in scope than that. Absolutely, I think co-ops and cannabis are sort of match made in heaven in a lot of ways. I'm a big proponent of co-ops, and I think there's a lot of opportunity in them as an alternative form of organizing ourselves. And I definitely think in the cannabis space that there's more opportunity than there has been. That's long been something we've wanted to do in with our business. And one of the things I've discovered in all of this is it's not very easy to convert a business into a co-op unless it's making enough money to pay for itself, because nobody wants to become a member of a co-op that requires them to spend a bunch of money to join. So we need viable business ecosystems for small businesses at all for the co-op to work in the cannabis space. But I think Rhode Island did a really terrific job of integrating some specific co-op related language. Definitely a good place to look. Reclaim Rhode Island, I think, was largely responsible for that. They're an organization that does organizing out there, and yeah, really good model there in Rhode Island for co-ops. Yeah, I mean, I think the role of the cannabis business, um, I think is important. But I do think that there's limits to its uh, ability to like affect change unto itself. So there's been a lot of work around repairing the harms on the war of drugs in the context of cannabis licenses and cannabis businesses. It often gets referred to as social equity, which is the sort of phrase that's used to describe these attempts to bring uh, equity and justice into the cannabis industry through owning these businesses. And the ability of that to go beyond the very small scale, I think is pretty limited because the obviously the harms of the war on drugs are, you know, huge and we couldn't even if we took all of the money that the cannabis industry produces and put it to try to repair those harms, it wouldn't be enough because the damage is and so to think that we can use cannabis alone to solve the problems that were not the fault of cannabis and make, cannabis consumers pay for that through these programs, I think is a bit misguided. I do think it's super important that uh, people that were harmed by the war on drugs have the first opportunity to be in the cannabis industry and are materially supported in that endeavor. But I wouldn't want us to think that we can like solve all the problems of the war on drugs through that. And the same kind of thing with uh, how much effect can it have on rural communities that have been underinvested for decades? I think some, but limited. And I think we should definitely do everything we can to make sure that the cannabis industry is inclusive and fair. But I also wouldn't want us to think that it can, we can use it to fix more problems than just doing it well, if that makes sense. But I would say that it can be an example of how an ecologically minded business can be successful, and then that can be a model for other industries and the rest of, agriculture and stuff like that. But I think its best capacity is in being an example. Yeah, I mean, if we had a more public financial infrastructure, I think we could have avoided a lot of the issues that came out of cannabis not having access to non-cash payments. I think we're far down that road now, so there's been some solutions that have been developed, but I think the place that the public bank could be the most beneficial in cannabis cultivation is not so much in payment services, but in credit, in providing through credit unions the ability to loan money to cannabis businesses to invest in their infrastructure. That's been unavailable to us, and had we had a public bank that was willing to uh, support some of that work, we could have seen, like for example, the social equity program, a lot of grant money got given away. If we had had a public bank in place that had the capacity to do it, we could have done that through, no interest loans in a way that might have been more effective because there could have been more money made available. So I think I see it as, another tool in the toolbox to give uh, opportunity to do other things. But I think uh, the payment issue specifically, I think is a good example. And certainly like 5 or 6 years ago, we could have made a huge impact in how things had gone. Yeah, so in Washington State, you can't open a new cannabis store. They're fixed licenses, and there's a set number of them, and there have been a round of social equity licenses that were allocated. A few of those stores had opened. Uh, the rest of those licenses that have been allocated, the folks that have been given that permission are finding it incredibly difficult to open those stores. The ability to locate them is very limited, both by the state and by local municipalities. Uh, the ability for a new entrant into those areas that are open to cannabis stores is really difficult because there's existing stores that are in those areas that are established and have relationships. So it's really very, very, very difficult and expensive and risky to open a cannabis business right now. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big proponent of brand control and pro tenant policies, eviction moratoriums, tenant opportunity to purchase ordinances. I mean, I think we need to do everything we can to address the housing crisis, and I think tenants' rights are, the top of the list. So I don't speak about uh, non-market housing as a the first line of defense or anything like that. It's just I think a thing that gets under discussed. And while I do agree that we do have uh, a lot of vacant housing that should have people living in it, I also think that we have a shortage of units in the places that people want, and I don't think we have the ability to build them uh, right now that is affordable. So I think that's also, an important uh, consideration. But I totally agree that we definitely need to uh, fight against the interests of landlords and in favor of tenants in every way we can. I'm a tenant. I'm a renter. I've been a renter all my life. I definitely in that fight, and but would also like to not be, and I don't necessarily want to be a homeowner either. So I want to, there's other ways to live than either of those options, and I want to be able to do that. I hope not. But that's definitely an option on the table. That's one policy proposal that's out there. Um, I would like to see those substances legalized in a non-commercial setting, first and foremost. And I think if we legalize them commercially before we legalize them for personal use, that we're gonna have the same sorts of problems that we have in cannabis. I think we should learn a lesson from what happened in cannabis and do something really different with mushrooms and psychedelics. Um, that is a tough question to answer right now. I would say I think that history has shown that in times of crisis, there's incredible opportunity for something different. I While I'm super disappointed with the results of what's happened this week, I would have been very disappointed no matter what happened. And I would have known that what I needed to do next was to try to continue to do the work that I've been talking about here. And I think that if we play our cards right and things don't go entirely off the rails, that there is going to be opportunity in the failure of the uh, the folks in charge on either end of the political spectrum. I think it's failure across the board, and I think we all have opportunity and obligation in that coming crisis to enact something radically different. And I think that without a crisis, it's going to be very difficult to do that. So obviously, it's a scary time, and there's things could go in a lot of different ways, but they could also get remarkably better if we come together and start to do things wholly differently than we've been doing it. And I think a moment of decline might be more likely for that to succeed than a moment where the system is going really well and is more impregnable.
Thank you, Micah. All right, folks, let's give a moment just to express our thanks for Micah joining us this week, being someone who is sharing their story and their wisdom in a challenging week. So, Micah, thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate it. I will also say personally, a lot of what you are talking about, we're talking about in some of my other classes. And so I appreciate the natural threads that you are weaving for some of our students that are in multiple classes this quarter.